Hey guys, and welcome to the Perfectly Wasted Podcast. I'm the host, DullOxide. Today is episode 50 on Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D. You can find all of my previous episodes on the Drinking Wisemen YouTube channel, along with the bi-weekly podcast, Brew the Truth. All my day-to-day photos and cosplay photos, cat photos also, on my Instagram at DullOxide. Now, if you've never heard of Dungeons & Dragons, Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy-based game that takes place with pen and paper and your imagination. It's also played with polyhedral dice, set standardly of 7, that have different values on it, usually to be able to determine outcomes inside of any specific fight. Now, this might not sound like, the most fun thing that you've ever done before, but if I ask you if you like video games, adventure-type games, RPGs, MMORPGs, basically almost any kind of video game that you can imagine, all of them have some aspects that were created from Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is kind of like the original game that started all fantasy games, if you will. And I know that's kind of like a really broad statement, but the things that you can do inside of a Dungeons & Dragons game are kind of like giving you full control of any character that you could ever play. So if you think about like your favorite RPG type game, or really almost any game that you can, any video game for that matter, that you could play, then basically Dungeons & Dragons is like a more advanced version of that. Now I say more advanced, even though it's obviously not played on a computer, so you don't have a bunch of computation happening in the background, but a lot of things that are from Dungeons & Dragons are incorporated into the majority of our favorite games. And those kind of things, just to give you an idea, are things like randomization, RNG, if you will. RNG initially starts by having something as simple as a random number generator generate a number. And that's essentially what you do with dice in Dungeons & Dragons. And then you have enchanted weapons, and you have different monsters and different fantasies and so on and so forth. There's just anything that you can imagine inside of your favorite games more than likely has some kind of root in Dungeons & Dragons. So how do they get from pen and paper to where we are now? Well, since not a lot of people really enjoy the idea of sitting down at a table and writing things out in pen and paper and having to converse with their own words, people took it into their own hands, and they decided, well, what if instead of having a conversation myself from me to another person who's dictating the story, we just pre-write a story, and then we go through and we have it so that all of our verbal interactions are just already pre-written, and we make our own story, our own movie, if you will. It's going to be our own form of entertainment that's streamlined so that the end user doesn't have to go through and make these kind of difficult decisions. So that in itself is kind of what Dungeons & Dragons is that you get to go through and act out your character exactly how you want to. Whether that means that you want to be silly or, super intellectual, or any number of things that you could put into character as character traits, you can choose all of these things. Now, it is a little bit difficult because obviously these are all things that you would pre-select and, have to go through and have different numbers to go through and dictate exactly, like, for instance, how charismatic you are. So there are a couple of things that Dungeons & Dragons kind of hold you back on for those things. Inside of character creators for video games, standardly you have a lot of different access inside of the game to be able to control that specific character. In Dungeons & Dragons, it's limited by the rules of the game to make the game more interesting. So at level 1, you get to choose all of your base character information, what type of equips that you have, the job types that you might have, the professions, things that you might be proficient in, things like this that over the years have evolved to where we are now with 5th edition. In 5th edition, they've actually incorporated a lot of different cool little things to make it a little bit more similar to how you might see video game characters, and it makes it a little bit more interesting, if you will. One of the actual additions inside of 5th edition is they've really played hard in getting miniatures into play. So miniatures are little miniature versions of the character that you've made. And in the past, they haven't been really very intricate. You couldn't really get a little miniature of your character that was exactly your character without having something very custom ordered or by, kind of jumbling a couple of things together and making it work yourself. But nowadays they have quite a few options to make very, very customizable characters. Unfortunately, some of them are a little bit pricey, but realistically, you can use anything as a miniature. You could even print out and make your own miniatures out of, just like heavy stock paper and have them on their own little miniature plates. And there's tons of different ways to enjoy this kind of game with miniatures, basically. Now, that being said, Dungeons and Dragons characters are, as I stated, pretty similar to your standard fare for like RPG characters. You get to choose what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. You actually roll your set of polyhedral dice to figure out what those are. And now, depending on who is being the dungeon master for your game, who is basically the storyteller for your game and controls all aspects of the game as far as like battle goes, non-player characters go, items, things like this, he is basically who you're playing against. If you want, like, he is the game creator. So in video games, you have a company that creates the entire game for you. And in Dungeons and Dragons, that's what your dungeon master does. Now, that could be by selecting a pre-selected adventure or quest, or it could be by creating things all on their own. They also have homebrew rules and different things that you can just kind of spice up your standard game with. But realistically, the dungeon master is going to make all of the big decisions on essentially what your characters are going to do throughout the game. Now, the thing that's very interesting about Dungeons & Dragons, to me at least, is that instead of just having one character who would be like the main character inside of a video game, you have several people that are the main characters. So they're the ones that are building the adventure and playing through the adventure the entire time. And everyone kind of goes through turns, and there's different things like your initiative bases, whether or not you're inside of a certain turn order, and every character that's currently in play inside of the game is able to play through their actions. So it's kind of like a very well balanced way for many people to play through a game. Similar to how board games have a turn order, so does Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I know it sounds a little bit confusing. You have this sheet that you write out all of this information on that basically sums up your entire character, and you write a background for your character and you get to act it out a little bit if you want to. Not a lot of people do role play because they find it's kind of boring, but that's basically what it is that it is fantasy role playing based on a sheet that tells exactly what your character has. Now, I understand that to a lot of people that sounds extraordinarily boring, but it is the essence of where all video games came from today, pretty much. So if you are into video games, and if you do like having more control over your character and being able to select pretty much any aspect of that character's life, then you'll probably enjoy Dungeons & Dragons. Now, depending on your dungeon master, you might not be able to select everything that you like. For instance, you might actually want to play like a swordsman or a fighter or something like that, but depending on what kind of roles you get for your stats, your intelligence, your wisdom, your charisma, your strength, things like this, you might not be able to choose exactly the kind of class that you want. So if you have a nice dungeon master, they'll let you pre-select it and then be able to adjust your roles to be able to fit your character need. If you don't, then they might just have you roll and say, those are the numbers that you have, you're stuck with them. In which case, as you progress through the game, and if you have selected a class that doesn't quite match your roles, it might make it more difficult to play your role, if you will. So that's something to consider. It makes it a little bit more difficult, but in a lot of video games, you might find that kind of aspect as well. Maybe you want to be the guy that can go up and destroy things in one punch, for instance, or be able to be the best mage type class in whatever game that you're playing that might not have mages inside of it, really, but they do have magic, let's say. So Dungeons & Dragons is the kind of game that would let you control those different aspects, and I'd say that if you're really into that kind of stuff, then go ahead and try and get into a group. They actually have groups online now that you can get into, and they've really branched out. I mean, pen and paper is kind of the basic way of saying it, but they have digital character sheets now. You can get into games online. There are forums all over the place about it. You can find digital versions of all of the different books online. Might not be, strictly speaking, legal to own them, but a lot of places do share them. There is basic player handbooks that you can go through and read, the Dungeon Master Guide. All of these books that they have to be able to get into the game are not extraordinarily expensive. They're between $20 and $50. You could find them brand new or used. I'd recommend trying to check out a couple of podcasts or play videos online. There are actually quite a few that are out there so that you can get an idea if it's something that you might actually like. So with that being said, that's kind of like a basic look at Dungeons & Dragons. If you did have any comments or questions about the game, please do comment down below. If you have any suggestions for future podcasts, please direct message me or comment down below as well. With that being said, thanks again for joining us today. That was, again, 10 Minutes Perfectly Wasted.